Good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning. Can everybody hear me? Good morning. If you chose to be in the air quality work group, this is it. We have the biggest room because we had the largest number of people who chose the air quality issue. Thank you very much. I'd encourage you to move in if you would, because we aim to make this a conversation that's as interactive as possible. And we are going to be, one of the goals of this work group is to come up with 3 priority areas to bring to the luncheon panel. So we are going to reach out for your input too, and if you're more comfortable coming where we can see you and make eye contact, I welcome you to do so. My name is Nancy Ibrahim. I'm the executive director of an organization based in South Central LA called Esperanza Community Housing. We're an organization that has, by necessity, been one of the proud founding members of the Stand LA coalition, standing together against neighborhood drilling. And neighborhood drilling has been one of the banes of our community as a community developer, looking at the emissions that come from vehicle transport, but particularly extraction activities in what is otherwise a largely residential community. So I have been asked today to moderate a panel with 4 very extraordinary experts. I will refer you to the biographies in your packet because it has a much more robust introduction. For me, I would just like to express my pride and the honor that I feel in being asked to join Trish Koman, Darryl, Sarmiento, Angelo Logan, and Bhavna Shamasunder to the panel. So if you would welcome the panel with me, I'd appreciate it. I personally would be remiss if I didn't thank all of the promotoras de salud and community health workers who are here among all of the health professionals and academics for the work that is really at the front lines of primary prevention. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to you all for choosing this panel and being part of this day in the midst of lots of very pressing concerns outside these walls. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask the panel to begin. If you would just introduce yourself and say what your role is where you are, and then we'll get into the pit, starting with Trish.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I think that our role on the panel is to be your guide, to help your work come forward to the next session. So I look forward to working with you all. I come from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. I work on air quality research as an environmental epidemiologist. So I study the sources of disease, especially related to air pollution, thinking about cardiovascular health, lung health, reproductive health, neurological health from air pollution. But I come from it in a different way than most of my colleagues, because I spent over 20 years working for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Mm-hmm. So I think about how that research will be used in communities under the law. And so that connection between the law, technology, and our health are some vital ways that I approach my work. I'm also very interested in chemical policy, and I know we'll have a chance to hear more about that. But I'm helping to lead a group of clinicians, scientists, and others to try to make sure that primary prevention is done under the new TSCA, or Toxic Substance Control Act, Lautenberg amendments, and we can get into that. It's not necessarily strictly air pollution, but it's another opportunity to use the law as a primary prevention way to consider public health.
Thank you. Darryl.
Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Darryl Molina Sarmiento. I'm the new Executive Director of Communities for a Better Environment. I've been with the organization for 12 years now and just started in my role a few months ago. And I'm also 8 months pregnant, so it's really timely and exciting to be here with all of you and see you all this morning. CBE, we've been around for nearly 40 years. Next year, we'll be celebrating our 40th birthday. And we are a statewide environmental justice organization really doing our work through our triad model of legal, in-house legal, policy, technical expertise, rooted in our foundation of community organizing. So we work in the communities of Southeast Los Angeles County, Wilmington, part of the city of Los Angeles, East Oakland, and Richmond to really advance our campaigns around pollution prevention, stopping the bad, and pushing for the good, just transition towards a clean energy infrastructure and clean transportation, economy, and jobs.
Hello, everyone. My name is Angelo Logan, and I'm with the Urban and Environmental Policy Institute at Occidental College. My primary role is to help to facilitate and coordinate a national network called the Moving Forward Network. It's a network of about 50 organizations across the country, and we work to help support and coordinate community organizing and policy efforts to address environmental justice, climate justice, primarily focusing on freight impacts in freight communities such as ports, freight corridors and freeways, rail yards, and warehousing.
Thank you. Bhavna.
Hi, I'm Bhavna Shamasunder. So I'm at the Urban and Environmental Policy Department at Occidental College. We have an institute, which is a community-based arm of our academic program. Oxy is a primarily undergraduate institution. I work at the intersection of environmental health science, but I'm actually a social scientist thinking about science, and I teach my students to learn rigorous community engaged research methods as a part of sort of their larger engagement with urban and environmental policy issues. So I have two big sort of research projects. One is I work with Standele on supporting some of their research and thinking about the transition from kind of air pollution monitoring and supporting that kind of ongoing work and moving to a more renewable energy future. And I also work on beauty product exposures to women of color and the disproportionate effects that kind of disproportionate marketing combined with environmental health hazards has for women of color.
Thank you. Bhavna, while we're down at that end of the table, do you want to kick us off and identify one particular air quality issue that you are investing your work in at this particular time, and what are some of the immediate challenges? And then we'll follow up in this direction. Thanks.
So one of the things that we have spent some time working on is thinking about how to address air quality in a cumulatively impacted neighborhood. So we know that neighborhoods of color, low-income communities in LA are disproportionately exposed. We have accepted cumulative impacts to be something that exists at the state of California, that communities are disproportionately impacted, and these are cumulative burdens. We've been less successful in thinking about how to move away from our regulatory structure that deals with source-by-source exposures and measuring, having to identify, well, this pollutant X led to illness Y. We know that's sort of impossible in a scientific framework. So thinking about what are new methods we can kind of leverage to work in a cumulatively burdened neighborhoods on air pollution.
Thank you. Angelo.
Yeah, so one of the major issues that I've been working on with a number of coalition partners for about the last 15 years is the 710 Corridor Project. And for folks that aren't familiar with that particular project, it's a freeway that primarily services trucks that come from the ports of LA and Long Beach to warehouses and rail yards in East Los Angeles and City of Commerce and the surrounding areas. The plan is to expand the freeway to allow for about 3 times as many trucks coming from the ports. And as you know, the trucks that come out of the ports are combustion engine. Majority of them are diesel fueled, which mean that diesel exhaust is saturating the communities along the 710 corridor, which happens to be one of the most impacted corridors in the county. A lot of respiratory issues, premature deaths, obesity, diabetes, park poor, and so the effort is to require that the expansion of this freeway project requires a zero-emission truck corridor and not allow for an increased amount of diesel trucks.
For CBE, we, like I mentioned, we work on a wide variety of issues from XI technologies, toxic polluters, like that. But the issue I'm going to speak to really is the expansion and rampant fossil fuel infrastructure that exists specifically in Southern California, in the city of Los Angeles, in Wilmington, and its neighboring communities, including Southeast LA. Have any of you been to Wilmington before or have seen it before? So we know that drilling happens there, the extraction, the refining of that oil happens there, the storage, and the consumption. All of that is happening in this one part of the neighborhood of the city of Los Angeles. And we see continued rapid expansion of oil refinery infrastructure. We have the highest concentration of oil refineries in the state of California in Wilmington. The Air Quality Management District just approved the expansion, the combining of two of the major oil refineries, BP and Tesoro, to make it the largest West Coast refinery in the nation. We are also seeing rampant expansion of oil drilling within the city of Los Angeles. Over half of the city's wells are located in the community of Wilmington. In addition to like the consumption aspect of it, like Angelo mentioned, a freeway expansion from the 710 freeway, which we work in partnership with the folks that Angelo mentioned. And so we see it all here. We feel it all. We understand the community members that are on the front lines of these industries are the leaders of our organization. They are the ones that are giving their voice to these struggles, have been exposed to the media, and have been advocating and fighting for their communities and their families' health.
Wonderful. It's so great to hear about the work being done on these deep systematic issues. I am currently working on a project to look at how the Clean Air Act can be used to help protect women of reproductive age who want to start a family, and to think about how pregnancy can be considered a stress test, if you will, for your cardiovascular system. And we know that air pollutants that were mentioned are connected to our cardiovascular health. And so it's a preventable part of an exposure that women have, and one among many. I would agree completely that a cumulative risk framework is a correct one to consider. But right now, under the Clean Air Act, pregnant women have not been given any special consideration in the risk assessment for any of the standards that have ever been set. I think that should change. And so that's part of my work, to try to bring the science forward and to think about it from a policy perspective. I think in your own work, one of the things that you can all think about doing as you move forward from here is we talk a bit insularly about our own work. And when we say preterm birth, we all know what that means and how that impacts someone's life going forward. But that's a shorthand for a deeper systematic thing that could be expanded upon. And I think part of our role is to help educate the public, decision makers, et cetera, so that our short-term words for that can be part of a deeper fabric so that people can understand how important this really is and the full impact of that. So I invite you to try to bring that into your own conversations.
Thank you. And I would also begin to address the entire move in our communities, the academic, scientific, public health communities, away from a dependence on risk assessment and more on a health impact analysis, because risk assessment really is something that's designed to protect the polluters, and the health impacts are what frontline communities, wherever we are, deal with. So I very much appreciate this new focus, and also the orientation in our renewed Department of Public Health in Los Angeles County toward putting primary prevention back into public health. I wanted to ask you in that regard, we've just heard very, very briefly about a number of focuses. We know that the 710 is going to expand with everything we know, that the Wilmington area has just been allowed to increase the impact of the oil industry on the neighborhood. I just wanted to, as a regulatory environment cynic from much experience, if you would say something about the regulatory environment in which you're functioning.
Well, I guess I get to take the long view. We recently at U of M had a panel discussion among the general counsels of the EPA, so the top lawyer at EPA over Clinton administration through Obama. And interestingly, they were talking about the long arc of the law and how long things take. And there can be a real disconnect between people's lived experience and this long arc of the law. And I find that in my own work, that there's a disconnect sometimes between the immediate needs that people have and this long arc of the science as well. And thinking about the Clean Air Act, originally it did focus on the health impact, but the science tools weren't ready. And so when the Clean Air Act was renewed in 1990, said, well, forget about trying to assess benzene health risks. Let's just go forward with something simple. You know what the industries are. We'll make a pie chart of them. We'll start with the most important ones and work around and regulate by technology. But then that doesn't work very well sometimes when we think about communities, because we have so many different things and it seems very disjointed. And so we're now kind of making a full circle towards looking at more of a risk-based standard and understanding that better. And so I think that there's this long-term arc of how we try to approach these problems, and it can be frustrating when we're stuck in the middle of them sometimes. But I think that we, as we're thinking about our advocacy, also need to keep in mind that long-term goal as we're working day to day for our communities with the great work that's going on here.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about our relationship with regulatory agencies. Historically, CBE has been engaged with regulatory agencies for decades. With the South Coast Air Quality Management District specifically, we were one of the organizations that really pushed them on adopting environmental justice as a principle, as a foundation for the work that they do. Now, equity is being used a lot as well. That partnership has resulted in really taking our regulators to the communities that they are serving and that are being impacted by their policies, so they really have a deeper understanding of their rulemaking, of the impacts of their rulemaking, because many of them don't live in the neighborhoods that are being impacted by their policies. We want to collaborate. It's really important to collaborate, but at the same time, it also takes sometimes decades to really push these agencies to take action. And the meetings are not always accessible. They're far away. They're during the day. They're not in the primary language. Community members don't know when the meetings are, don't even know how to engage at that technical level. And so the role of community-based organizations like mine, like CBE, is really to bridge that gap. But there's still so much more that needs to be done. If they're not engaged with an East Yard or a CBE, how would they know? How would they be able to even be taken seriously at these regulatory bodies or hearings when you have oil industry lobbyists and industry lobbyists there with their high-paid lawyers, high-paid scientists, having the ear of our regulators. And so I think it's an ongoing battle and a struggle for us. It's really important for us to have allies on staff. It's really important for us to advocate for statewide policies that push these agencies to have environmental justice seats on these regulatory boards. We've been able to do that at the California Air Resources Board. We've tried to have that done at the South Coast Air Quality Management District, and that policy initiative failed. So we need to continue to have folks like us on these seats at the regulatory table, encouraging our community members to do participatory action research, to build those technical skills so that they can go to college and work for these agencies, which we've seen a lot of our community members being able to advance. And now one of my former youth members that I used to organize works at an air quality management district in the San Joaquin Valley. So those are the types of successes that we need to build, that community expertise. We are the ones that need to be at the seats at the table.
Yeah, in terms of air quality regulations, my understanding is that most regulations, if not all, are supposed to be justified and guided by health goals and objectives. But when we're looking at the particular regulations, we're not really looking at what the health impacts are. We're looking at the source, the individual source. And in communities, we don't live in silos, and we don't live in communities that are the average community throughout the state or the country. In particular, communities along freight corridors or in communities like Wilmington are saturated with numbers of sources, whether they're mobile sources or stationary sources. So instead of having an average amount of trucks traversing your neighborhood, you may have 200, 300 times more trucks in your neighborhood. So the impact to your neighborhood is different than what an impact to a different neighborhood would be. So looking at the regulatory framework, we have to move away from looking at the individual source and looking at the community from a community perspective. And so that gets at some of the issues that were mentioned earlier in the opening around cumulative impacts and magnet sources, and so that we can really approach the issue to address and resolve some of the health impacts. So going from source to looking at cumulative and magnet sources as well, such as ports, warehouses, rail yards, oil refineries. These are all magnet sources and need to be looked at from a facility-based approach.
So I'll extend what Angelo said, and from a researcher perspective, I would say that a few years ago we did a study for Metro on climate adaptation, and they were interested in, how do we adapt to a changing climate? And we looked at the most vulnerable communities. One of the communities we looked at was Pacoima, and asked the question, Pacoima we know has very poor air quality, is zoned industrial, has lots of environmental injustices, and how do you deal with this? If you're waiting for the bus in the heat, you might need a bus shelter and you might need a source of water. And these sort of very practical suggestions were Metro said, we don't have jurisdiction like this. We can't deal with the bus shelter. We can't put in the water faucet or a fountain, drinking water fountain. And, the city is responsible for the bus stop. The public health department is responsible for this other thing. And that sort of, from someone who's saying, well, let's look at Pacoima and what Pacoima needs, that there's such fragmentation in kind of looking that is debilitating in looking at a community holistically. And so not only what Angelo says, but kind of these fragmentations, and everyone is passing the buck. This is not my job, this was their job. And they're the ones who failed and not us. We acted quickly. It's, kind of in their court. And I think that we need an overhaul of our bureaucracies and a reorganization of our systems to better map onto the ways communities are structured. And because I think I have a cynical perspective in that the ways that it's structured now, I actually see that there's always going to be a gap. Someone's going to fall through the crack. And, but I think that, if we can kind of take on a reorganization or thinking bigger, that would be more productive.
Thank you. So frontline communities, as we know and we have heard, are often marginalized in the kind of data that we collect and the kind of research we try to do, even in very creative relationships that we may have with academic partners, such as Esperanza has with Occidental and USC and UCLA. And yet we are the ones who are having to make the case against the paid litigators and the scientists who are on the industry payroll to make the case about the kinds of toxins or the nature of the health impacts of emissions on our communities, frontline communities. Can we talk a little about what best practices that emerge for you in how best for frontline communities working with academic partners or alone to really make the scientific case in a compelling way so that we can push policy and legislation in the directions that need to go to be protective of our communities. And Trish, I don't know if you in Michigan have direct interfaces with some of the frontline communities in Michigan.
Sure, yeah. I could talk a little bit about that. So in my work, I've worked in Flint, Michigan, and in Detroit, and in a little town called Willow Run, which is a 10-minute drive from my house. And similar to many areas, we have impacted communities. When I saw the statistics here with the disparities in birth outcomes, Detroit and Flint certainly have that, even more dramatically than here. And so it's something that we struggle with a lot. In working with communities, I've always taken the approach that the community needs to be the one driving the situation. The difficulty is that there's just, so many limitations in terms of the way that science can work. And sometimes what people want is not science per se, but more of science advocacy. And that's really a different sort of thing. And so I try to talk a little bit about the differences between those two situations. So science is a little more exploratory, but the thing that makes it set apart is that it's procedures that are open and transparent and reproducible, that anyone could do the same thing and get the same results. And that's one of the hallmarks of a scientific endeavor. That's very different than science advocacy where you're making an argument. Mm-hmm. And so trying to distinguish the two. The other point that I would make is oftentimes what a community wants to do is to understand the state of evidence. And so they're often looking for education or training rather than discovery science, if you will. And it's been my experience that communities do not want things dumbed down, but oftentimes that's what researchers hear, that people want the crystallized, simple explanation in a nuanced way without all the jargon. And that's understanding the problem in a very important way, understanding the way that the communities see it in a very important way as well, that helps to drive the research question as well. And I think that oftentimes people who do laboratory research miss that in some ways. So I think that there's a lot of education of researchers that communities, unfortunately, often have to do.
Yes, we've experienced that, certainly. Darryl?
Yeah, we've had a lot of experience working in partnership with academic institutions and doing research partnerships. I think really what's key is the partnership aspect of working with communities every step of the way and really valuing the community expertise of the residents that are experiencing these issues on the ground on a day-to-day basis with their children, with their own health, and really caring for the future generation of their families and of their community and being able to stay in their community. So I think it's really important as a key value of accountability within these partnerships that that's held as a standard. These community-based participatory research is really important and empowering for our community members. We have youth programs at CBE. We work with adults. We meet on a weekly basis with our leaders and reach out to thousands of youth and adult members throughout the year. And so we that partnership with community organizations that already have those relationships with folks on the ground is really important, and developing those questions together, doing the research together, giving those tools of empowerment to our community members, not just have the researchers or the students do it themselves, but how can they train our members so that we can build that knowledge within our organizations to be able to not just end at this research study, but to continue to do this. Unfortunately, if we document 50 nosebleeds, that won't have the same weight as this coming out in a peer-reviewed scientific journal coming from an academic partner or research partner. So those partnerships are really key and really important for us to to not only validate what we have already experienced on the ground, but it helps the regulators also take that knowledge and take that information seriously, and that helps us all advance our policy objectives moving forward.
Yeah, I would echo both what was said just now. Also, the one thing that I can add is that I really believe that this partnership really should start from the encouragement and the community seeking the partnership from the beginning to the end. So in other words, that those, even the topics or the areas, that it should come from the community, and the community should be asking or seeking out partnerships.
Oops.
It just went up. Seeking out those partnerships with the academic partners and so forth, identifying what the topics are, identifying the ways in which they're going to roll out the research, all the way to the end product. So I think that's really important. It means that this is something that the community needs and wants, and it's not something that is pushed upon them and enticed through whatever types of enticements there may be that come along with that. So really led by and for the community from the beginning to the end product.
Thank you. Bhavna.
So I think I all agree with Trish in that science needs to be reproducible. It needs to be evidence-based, that researchers are really held to our standard of producing, rigorous primary data. And in kind of working with communities there, I think I recently did a training for the Mario Pando Institute and that East Yard runs, and they are young undergraduate and recently graduated students who are from communities and they want to be scientists. And so there are also community-based participatory research projects that can be scientifically rigorous. There are also community questions that cannot be studied through a scientific framework. So I think all of this is true, and I think communities are really agile and understand, kind of when you sit down and parse out sort of what can fit within a project frame and what might be advocacy or policy relevant, I think that this is then an agreed upon negotiation that we're going to do this one and you're going to do that one, or we're going to do this one and not that one. And I think it's the question of having an open conversation about kind of what's possible, because science can't answer questions that are moral and ethical sometimes. And so I think being clear about that.
Hey, Angelo,
if I can just add one more thing, I think it's really important to consider the position of the relationship, where you sit within that relationship. And so from academic partners, we need to make sure that that we're supporting the community organization rather than coming in and trying to either dominate or direct the relationship or the partnership or the study. The other thing is to consider the ownership, right? Mm-hmm. Who owns it and how it's used and how it's made public. So that has to be really talked through and agreed upon as you both engage in the project as well as when you release it.
Thank you. I think before we open it to the floor, I'd like to just say I'm just how overwhelming it is to have a conversation, intelligent conversation about these issues and about the successes that we have had and ways that we've moved to bring frontline community issues to the forefront. And also to hear from our Department of Public Health that there is now support to actually engage in primary prevention and to respect that and invite it. So the hope is that we won't again have these challenges of waiting till the AQMD comes in with their report or any other regulatory agency before a health action can be taken. I wonder if there's any, in the face of the increase in fossil fuel, the fossil fuel economy, if you might discuss that and maybe even add a call to action, then we'll open it to the floor. Whoever wants to begin.
So maybe I could broach the conversation around addressing air quality impacts from mobile sources, specifically trucks. So one of the latest, or I don't want to say latest, but one of the issues that is really elevated as a point of contention is this idea that we have a bridge fuel to address diesel trucks. And this bridge fuel would be natural gas. And so there is this real huge move to deploy natural gas trucks using natural gas fuel as a bridge between diesel trucks and electrified trucks. And I think that that's something that's really important to think about in terms of the investments that we would be making in a fossil fuel and or combustion mode of operation for trucks if we really want to get to a point where we have zero tailpipe emissions in our communities, especially the communities that are overly impacted by truck traffic and diesel and other types of air quality impacts. The other thing about this emissions from natural gas is that it is still air pollution. It's a displacement of the type of diesel pollution, but one of the major things to consider is that the emissions coming out of the natural gas vehicles are ultrafine, and the ultrafine particles are considered to be toxic just because for the pure nature of the size of the particles. This is a major issue that we really need to think about in figuring out how to transition from diesel and combustion to zero emission electrified transportation.
And I'll add to that, one of my first fossil fuel campaigns was to stop the construction of a 943 megawatt natural gas power plant in the city of Vernon. And CBE and our partners worked to prevent that natural gas power plant from being built within a mile of 300 schools, daycare centers, hospitals, churches, community spaces. And so not only is it bad when it's being burned, these power plants are being built in already overburdened environmental justice communities. And we know that is natural gas as a bridge fuel is a false solution. All of our community members know that near zero emission is not what we're pushing for. We are pushing for a zero emission freight corridor. We want to decarbonize. We want to electrify transportation, decarbonize the grid as well through renewable energy resources. And what's needed is really research to model the feasibility of this. We're being told that maybe the technology doesn't exist, but that's false. The technology exists. Our economy is completely embedded in the fossil fuel industry, and we need to move away from that. We need modeling to show to bring these costs down in order for that technology to be available and for it to be equitably distributed in communities that are most impacted. And so we've been working around doing that work, making sure that these alternatives are actually being seen in the frontline communities. We want to show that it's more cost effective than the cost of continuing us in this fossil fuel infrastructure for decades to come. The health costs, we need to model the ability for this to create jobs. We also just want to, I just also want to say that we need to, in general, just stop the fossil fuel infrastructure expansion of oil drilling, freeway expansion, oil refinery expansion. We need folks like you at the table here today to be coming to these community meetings, coming to the hearings. They've heard from us as environmental justice advocates. We bring 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 community members. We sign on to EIR comments in the hundreds, doing classroom presentations, getting our members to talk about why we need these alternatives. But it's wonderful to have folks like you, health professionals, people on the field, nurses, scientists, public health professionals, also use their voice and their expertise and speak directly to regulators because they hear from you differently. They've heard from us a lot. We need to hear from you as well. Thank you.
So I would agree that the voice is so vitally important. I want to make one point about the difference between traditional air pollutants and climate gases. So it's a framework shift that you should be aware of. We think about traditional air pollution with the people near the source. You see the maps, and we think about impacted communities. For climate gases, they're more long-lived. Carbon dioxide is more long-lived in the environment. It can last 50 to 100 years. So the pollution plume, if you will, of what you're leaving behind when you drive your car somewhere or a truck is driven somewhere or a utility is burned, stays in our global airshed for a really long time. So it's a generational equity issue as well. And it's something that we don't see, and so we don't think about it a lot, but vulnerable communities in island nations and other places are bearing the brunt of our nation's contribution. And so it's a really important distinction to be thinking about as we do those very necessary assessments to understand climate as well as traditional air pollution.
Thank you. And I would also add, just going back to Darryl's mentioning of the health costs, that is an area where we absolutely need the best minds and study to really quantify what are the health costs for communities, all of us in this climate airshed as we hear it, and to put those costs directly into all planning and assessments for regulating an industry that is largely rogue in many cases. I'm going to open it up, if I may, just because thank you all for going through those questions. I would like to say that the questions that we've been guided by have come out of the committee's experience with many of you, but I think we want to take it to you directly, those in the room, for your input, your questions, your contributions. And I think we have, yes we do, we've got 2 mics in the room. If any of you would like to pose a question or a concern. There's one over here and here. Thank you. And while we're waiting for the mics to reach, I just want to take a minute to thank our translators who, even though we've been taking turns speaking, have been speaking nonstop. So I want to appreciate Delia in this case and her colleagues for keeping the conversation bilingual. Yes.
Buenos días a todos.
Buenos días.
Mi nombre es Blanquestela Chávez y vengo de IDESCA. Es que así yo no puedo hablar. Pues se me va la onda a mí así.
Okay.
Yo voy a hablar directo y espero que entiendan.
So I'll be talking directly, and I hope that you understand what I'm saying.
Las organizaciones que están aquí,
So the organizations that are here,
de que aún aquí debería de haber mucho más gente en este lugar,
that even though there
tratándose
should be
del
more
tema que
people
estamos
here,
tratando.
especially to speak about the issue that we're discussing
Creo
here.
que el tema hoy es el medio ambiente.
So
Y es una
believing
cosa
that
que
the issue here is
ya
the
no
environment
es
today.
cuestión de esconderlo, sino que ya es cosa muy popular y muy grande.
Although
Las
it's something that's
organizaciones
also
hablan
very popular
de que deben
and
de
large.
tener jóvenes. Yo sí no puedo. Las organizaciones o las jóvenes están hablando de que la comunidad y la comunidad.
So the panelists are
Pero
speaking about the
a esas
community.
alturas ya no se trata de hablar y hablar,
But at this height
de hacer
of the issue,
comités
it's
con
not
mucha
about
gente,
just talking and talking.
de hacer juntas. Sino, ¿saben qué? Es acción.
It's not
Acción,
about
pero
just
ya.
meetings
¿Por
and
qué?
meetings, but it's actually
Porque
about
el
taking
aire
action.
ya está demasiado contaminado en
Because-
todo el
Because
mundo.
the air, it's already very
Aquí, en las
contaminated
mañanas,
all
ya no
around the
vemos la
world.
claridad del amanecer.
Now
¿ok?
we don't
Ya
enjoy
está todo
even the
nublado,
morning because everything is clouded.
está todo pues contaminado como se ve.
Everything is contaminated the way it looks.
Hicimos ahora el 4 de este mes del día Holiday una protesta con más de 1,000 gentes. A mí me encantó
In the
la
last
protesta
holiday that we
y
just
la
had, the
masa
4th,
de
we
gente
had
así.
an action with over 1,000 people, and I loved it.
El punto es de que ya no es cuestión de sino tomar acción con la masa de gente.
The
Con la
point is
masa
that
de
it's
gente.
important to be taking action with the masses.
La cosa es de que si nos importa el medio ambiente, ya no es cosa de estar pensando ni de estar,
The
sino
thing
de
is
tomar
that
acción.
if this issue of the environment matters to us, it's not about keep on talking.
que tomara una visión ya más larga, más grande.
To
¿Qué
take
se
a
puede hacer
larger
acerca?
vision.
Se puede hacer mucho
We
con
can
la
do a lot
comunidad unida,
as
junta,
community that's
todos y
together.
hagamos una protesta completamente formal acerca del medio ambiente,
That we
poniendo
actually
cartelones,
take a
todo lo que
protest
es
and
eso, que
actions
es,
about
afecta mucho la
everything that we're
salud.
doing and how it impacts our health.
Es que yo no puedo, así bueno, pero es que sí preocupa mucho eso. Si existen
So that
organizaciones
worries us a lot.
que están unidas, pues yo no sé qué es lo que están haciendo.
I don't understand what the organizations are doing if they say that they are together.
La noticia por el radio o por la televisión no se escucha. Una más aquí, otra más acá, otra más acá. Que hagamos ya movimientos mundiales acerca de la contaminación.
So we hear
porque eso
different
ya
news
donde
in the
quiera
radio or
está.
television that there is something going on here, something going over there, but we need to do something large in international levels.
No sé cómo poder tomar acción en eso. Yo estoy en el medio ambiente porque nosotros nos dedicamos a eso y por eso me interesa. Hay muchas
I'm working
cosas,
on the environmental justice work because that's something that matters to us.
hay muchas cosas que hablar y muchas cosas que hacer. Si se pudiera hacer que fuéramos todos juntos, porque dice un refrán, hay dos manzanas.
There's a lot to be spoken and to work together, and if we can do that, all of us. And
Pero
there's a
no-
saying,
Pero las dos manzanas nada más son dos. Pero si tenemos 1000 gentes, existen 1000 ideas.
if there's two
¿Cómo poder?
apples, and there's two apples. But if we have 1,000 people, there is 1,000 ideas.
¿Cómo poder hacer las cosas mejor?
So how
Yo-
we
yo
can
diría-
actually do things better.
Y yo apoyaría más mejor ya acción.
I would
Acción,
support that we
acción
take
y
action
acción.
and action
Y
and
muchas gracias
action.
por oírme.
Perfect.
pero
Thank
es
you
que
so
yo no
much for
puedo hablar.
Thank
listening
you.
to me.
Gracias. Muchísimas
Gracias, muy
gracias,
amables.
señora.
Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. Fortunately, we have on the panel, and no doubt in the room, some of the leading environmental justice activists with calls to action and working on many, many different levels of the struggle. And we invite all of you, because we are, when it comes to air quality, we are all frontline communities to some extent. And we do all need to work together, and I think that this day was really designed to bring us closer together in our understandings and calls to action. Would one of you like to address, pardon me, señora, your name? Su nombre? Muchísimas gracias. Anyone would like to address the need for action on this issue?
Well, I'll take the opportunity to say that on October 13th and 14th, the Moving Forward Network is holding a conference. And although it may seem like a lot more talking, I would really characterize it as planning. This is an international conference where folks are going to come together to talk about the science, to become more informed, organizing strategies, policy agendas, and tactics for organizing for cleaner air and environmental justice. We're also going to have a conversation and dialogue around movement building. For folks from across the globe, we're going to talk about how we build a stronger movement based from our communities across the globe. So I have flyers. I want to make sure that everyone has that information and it comes out to that conference. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you, Angelo.
And I'll just say too, I came from Action. That's how I started off as a community organizer, working with the Filipino Worker Center, working at Communities for a Better Environment. And we have 4 of our community organizers here in the room right now. Kaylee, our youth organizer, Delia, our organizer in Southeast LA, Milton, our Southern California program director, and Ashley, a community organizer in Wilmington. And that's what we do, in addition to talking a lot, is we take action. We're on the streets, protesting, going door to door, working with our community members every single day to encourage folks to take action. And we want to come here today to encourage the other community that's here today that may not live in the neighborhoods. A lot of them do live in these neighborhoods, to also take action in the ways that they can. So thank you for your comments.
And I would add that throughout South LA and throughout the County of Los Angeles, those of us who are members of Stand LA, Standing Together Against Neighborhood Drilling, Los Angeles, are planning on major mobilizations to bring attention to the fact that The fossil fuel industry is wreaking havoc on the health of residential communities within the county, and we want it to stop. So there are several members of the Stand LA community at the luncheon panel. Marta Dina Arguello, who is one of the conveners, along with CBE of Stand LA, and we would be happy to talk about engaging you in our discussions and planning and action, which is the main reason why we're here. But thank you for putting the priority where it needs to be. Thank you.
I have a follow-up question on the ports and the trucks. I think that you were referring to the initiative by the mayors of LA and Long Beach, but is that the initiative for natural gas? So that's just a question. But also, as I understand it, I mean, I don't work there, but as I understand it, there's a longer history of the port truck drivers wanting to be treated as workers, not as individual contractors who are responsible when they can't really afford it. And I think I've heard that a lot of the port truck drivers are really in favor of the clean energy program, but they're demanding that the big companies pay for it because many of the port truck drivers themselves live in the impacted communities and they're very supportive, but they're also struggling to support their families. So what is the perspective on working with the port truck drivers in tandem to make the big companies pay for this?
Yeah, you're correct. So I guess to start with the mayor's executive directives, both the mayor of Los Angeles and the mayor of Long Beach have indicated that they have a goal to transition to 100% zero emissions at the ports by 2035. So that's a good start, but 2035 is a long way away. And we know that the technology will be available before that. So we want to advance that and accelerate it so that we have cleaner air sooner. But it is a good start. And through the Clean Air Action Plan at the two ports, they have indicated a number of programs. And from my perspective, they're not detailed enough. They're not really plans, they're goals. And so we're really pushing the ports to come up with very clear plans on how we achieve the zero emissions at the ports. In terms of the port drivers, you're correct. The way in which the programs are set up and the incentive monies are set up, the money is given to the companies. The companies then buy the trucks, and the burden is put on the drivers. So a lot of these companies are actually double dipping. They're buying the trucks with incentive money from the state, then they're charging the drivers the full amount for the truck, and they're used. They're go into a contract as independent drivers, but they function like employees, so they are misclassified. And that's one of our goals within the Clean Air Action Plan is that the two ports and the cities do not allow for companies to treat drivers with this type of disrespect and over undue burden. A lot of these companies have been found to be guilty of violating labor laws, and we believe that the two cities can prohibit those companies that are using this type of practice to operate in the ports.
Thank you. Julie, anybody on your corner? Other questions, concerns? Yes. So good to have Idebska in the house.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
Yo quisiera saber que no solo miremos para abajo, a nuestro alrededor, miremos para arriba. Yo quiero saber...
Say that for us to not just look down or around us, but that we also look up.
Yo quisiera saber si alguien me puede explicar por qué muchos aviones echan humo arriba. Y les he preguntado a muchos anglosajones.
So I also want to ask you, if we look up, why is it that when we see the planes passing by, it seems like they're releasing a lot of chemicals? And I've asked a lot of Anglo-Saxon people.
Y ellos me han contestado, algunos me han contestado que es borium y aluminum. Entonces yo quisiera saber si es cierto y por qué lo hacen y qué podríamos hacer para evitar eso, porque eso cuando ellos están echando demasiado humo a mí me da mucha alergia, me da comezón en la piel, me duele la garganta.
So some of the responses that I've heard is that it's volume and aluminum, and every time that airplanes pass, I get a lot of allergies and asthma.
Entonces, yo pregunto si alguien me puede contestar.
So I'm asking if
Gracias.
someone could speak to that.
Gracias. Do any of you have particular expertise that you want to share on the pollution from air transit as well that is impacting people below ground?
Go ahead if you want.
And while we're arguing this out, I will note that LAX recently changed its air patterns and moved them closer north to over South LA, and we're experiencing a lot more health effects as a result. Yeah.
So I was simply going to say this is not my area, but the U.S. EPA has a lab in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and on their website, and I'd be happy to take your contact information to find a person who does study this to be able to give you an answer. But you might know more.
We do know that there's more benzene exposures at the airport than, and it's actually the only place that the Air District has monitors for volatile organic compounds. And we know this because we wanted them to put VOC monitors elsewhere, but they do monitor for VOCs. They don't release that data to the public, so we'd have to ask them for it. We can ask them for it, and they're a little slow in handing it over. But so airports are point source pollutant places, and there is lots of contestation around things like LAX. Santa Monica recently had a big fight about their airport. So people who have means don't really want to live by the airport, and there's a reason for that.
Since we haven't really put a health face on this, would you mind saying what benzene is associated with in terms of health impacts?
So it's a volatile organic compound, which means it's hard to capture quickly. It volatilizes, it disappears. It's a carcinogen. It's a reproductive toxin. And, it's part of, you can say more about it from the Clean Air Act perspective, maybe.
Yeah, it's a hazardous air pollutant, and so is regulated. The difficulty with aviation is it's an internationally regulated issue in terms of the mobile source component of it. So you mentioned the airport, but there's also the component of during transit.
So there are resources available to keep an eye on that issue, as I think all of us need to as well. Other questions? Lynn.
Maternal and Child Health Access. Thank you. I wondered how the community agencies, others can get involved in the need to have a pregnancy lens on air pollution, not just because we care about pregnant women, because we all do, but it helps open the door for everybody else. Pregnancy in our work is always a way to get the same things for everyone else in the community too. So thank you.
For us, I think it's at the very root of our concerns around fossil fuel emissions. We know that many of those chemicals are deeply impactful on reproductive health, and in fact, most of the odorants that are used by the industry are endocrine disrupting elements. So for young people entering reproductive age as well, these are extreme concerns and extremes for warnings for fetal loss during frontline exposures as well. But would you like to speak to that? Angelo?
Yeah, I think I'd just like to mention one thing. Something that the morning speaker touched on was that to address the issue within the 9-month period is kind of futile, right? It's not that we can address it within that 9-month period, but we need to address it from a perspective of a whole community, because in our communities, people have babies and they go through that 9-month cycle. And also within our communities, we have other vulnerable populations like elders and so forth. So in my previous work, we really touched on the issue of pregnant women and birth outcomes and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's the whole family that really brought folks to participate in the debate and the advocacy around clean air, for sure, with a real lens and concern for that 9 months and for that young child's, that first 5 years of that child as well.
I just want to say one quick thing is that there is a study that's ongoing that Rachel Morello-Frosch at UC Berkeley is doing, looking at proximity to oil wells across the state of California and birth outcomes. So, I think looking for that to when that comes out. We know for birth outcome studies in LA County that microenvironments matter a lot. Actually, when you're very close to an air pollution source, you see adverse birth outcomes, and we've studied it. Beatriz at UCLA has studied particulate pollution and micro kind of environments. One of the problems is that birth outcomes data is IRB protected. It's released at the zip code level. We wanted to access it for a survey we did in South LA, but that data takes a long time to ask for, and then you have to clean it up, and it's just like a long process. But one of the reasons in our survey, we actually asked people what one of their health concerns were: miscarriages, a low birth weight, and babies born with developmental disabilities. And it's hard to study and it's hard to track. So I think one of the things we need is sort of a better kind of ground up approach, but also sort of the top down data.
And I think there's a call to action for those of us in long haul community-based organizations with very deep roots to, in our planning research with our academic partners, to really develop some longitudinal studies that don't leave us dependent on other research priorities. We need to have that data in our own communities.
So I would just add that the idea of low birth weight and some of the other birth outcomes, we know what those mean, but when you translate it into the policy-making world, it's a shorthand that doesn't connect. And so being able to articulate through examples and studies of how that has a long shadow over the family's life, the medical costs, those sorts of things can be very compelling. So I would encourage you to expand on why those are important outcomes. The other is, as I mentioned before, under the Clean Air Act, there are ample opportunities for public input to advocate on behalf of people of reproductive age to be included as an at-risk population, and be happy to talk with you after this about the specifics of doing that, because under the law, the administrator, when she or he now is setting a standard, can think about three things, and one of them is the size of the at-risk population, so it's really important.
Yeah, I think we just need to move from an approach towards prevention and precaution in general, because we don't want to get to a point where we saw with Exide, where the homes that were cleaned up first were the homes that had pregnant women and small children, and that's when it's already in crisis mode. And we need to be protecting folks way before it gets to that point. And all like Angelo said, all communities, all parts of the family need to be protected.
Thank you. So we were asked to come up with 3 priorities. I'm going to open it up. We have a few minutes left. I've heard that we need to focus on action. We need to focus on prevention and precaution, the precautionary principle. Are there other priorities that we want to raise up for the luncheon panel that is coming up? Yes. One moment. Let's get a mic to you. There we go. Thank you, Karen.
Being a nurse, absolutely, I am for the people and the women and the low birth rate. But then I realized that reality, back in the 1970s, remember where we had that gray-brown haze over the horizon? And then through regulations, we started regulating industries, and we kind of got rid of the haze for a small part. So through government regulation and incentives towards industry, because industry is one of the things that people need jobs, I'm looking at the more realistic view, and they have their lobbyists, they have their lawyers, of course they're the strong arm, but I believe that there are, for example, if we're talking about the pathway, from the port all the way down the 710, that's a huge corridor. So what is the incentive for the business, the trucking industry, to make improvements? I think there should be some kind of benefit for them to clean up their act, incentives, tax breaks, big things that will impact the the business to make those improvements? I mean, what else is going to drive them to do it? I believe that, we talk about clean air, clean energy, electricized vehicles. It takes a long time to make the changes. Can our infrastructure support a huge conversion to electricity? I mean, those are things to think about. But I think that through, I know that we've talked about, you see the solar panels on the homes. Government kind of stepped in to give incentives to people. I think that, working on a state level and a federal level, I think that policies and incentives could definitely, I mean, there's got to be a marriage there for these changes to happen, and then it trickles down to help the people, I think. That's my view.
Thank you. Any comments about tax breaks for the polluters and incentives and trickle down? Angelo?
I guess
dive in.
I would start by saying that these companies are multi-billion-dollar companies. And at the end of the day, they're making huge profits. Yes, it is true that they are putting some folks to work, but for instance, in the trucking industry, it's some of the lowest wages in the lowest wage sector in Southern California. And we just heard about concerns around the misclassification of drivers. So I would say that when we're investing public dollars in cleaning the air, that we need to invest those public dollars in technologies that are above and beyond the standard, and that we start to set up the infrastructure in such a way that we're thinking about the future for our communities and for our children. And so the investments and incentives should really go about long-term vision, and so that we can make those things happen. And in terms of reality, I think that it's important to note that it's not about the technology, or it's not about the cost. It's about political will and the will of the people. And I think it's been over 10 years that we sent a robot to Mars. If we can send a robot to Mars, we can definitely get electrified transportation in Southern California.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, Luis.
Thanks. Good morning. Luis Pardo from Worksite Wellness LA. And one of the comments that maybe we can insert is creating a sort of a reverse redlining for folks that live in hotspots and work in hotspots. Because there's one thing that, we're talking about fragmented lives. We live in one place, we might work in another place, and then the commute might be also a pollutant commute. So it's one of those things that we need to take into account, the holistic approach of the individual, and create safe zones for folks, particularly those that have been impacted by industry and construction and so forth. Yeah, we had some benefits throughout the region, and the environment has gotten better. I mean, I remember those days, the ugly old days of the early 80s and late 70s and the brown air. But and we made some progress, and it's wonderful, but not everybody is enjoying the same progress. Like we were saying before, the equity issue needs to be inserted into this dialogue as well.
Thank you. I think that we're beginning to see, maybe in some areas in South LA, we're beginning to see reaching out by those clean energy investments coming into the most cumulatively impacted communities to try to make the frontline communities at least benefit from cleaner technology. So I think that is beginning to be a trend. But I think unless we really start making serious changes that engage the political will, we will again have a brown haze in our future. And I think that we all need to be invested in making sure that doesn't happen, and to do so in a way that puts our expertise and your expertise into action, as has been strongly suggested here, so that the air that we breathe is a cleaner air, which is, whether you're an industrial polluter or a frontline community member, a universal good. So any last words? Yes, Marta. Hey.
I think we distracted you. You were asking what should be the top 3 things that we talk about next. And just hearing the question to my left, there's some misinformation out there. So maybe we should also talk about how we have like a campaign a communication campaign to educate folks who think that just because we don't have brown haze, we don't have pollution, right? Or who are being told by SoCalGas that it's renewable net zero emissions energy because they have all of the money to communicate in their favor. So we need to be strategic in how we communicate our message as well to ensure that people in our communities, because this information is being given out like in Southeast LA and in South LA, right? And they're being sent to conferences and workshops and fed. So how are we going to counter that messaging?
Thank you. And thank you, Marta. Any response to that? This is our last question of the day. Any last comments? Thank you for those suggestions. Panel?
Yeah, I agree. I think that education and trying to really parse out what is confusing and what's misinformation is huge. I spent half my time teaching undergraduates who come from lots of different backgrounds, and they come into college with lots of ideas that are, pretty misinformed. And I think trying to get everyone to a place where we have sort of a joint understanding of what's actually going on and what people might have been told or sold is, I think, super important.
Thank you.
Yeah. We've been impacted by environmental racism for generations now. And it's beyond time for us to move away from that and not to continue to commit our infrastructure, our taxpayer dollars in this antiquated technology. We know that the technology exists. We know that that there are these alternatives that exist. It is about the education. It's about the communication strategy. That's what we've been doing with our work with our community members, doing EV ride-in drives, presenting to the Huntington Park City Council for the need for public EV chargers in Huntington Park, the need to push for this zero-emission freight corridor along the 710 freeway. We know that these technologies exist. It is about the political power and the political will, and we're pushing back against the oil industry who is trying to keep us in their ways so that they can continue to profit off of our health. And we need to move away from that and empower our communities to stand up and put that communication out to the wider public.
Thank you. I think that without any objection, I think that is a brilliant last word. I want to thank our panel with you. If you would give a round of applause. And most of us will be here if you want to continue the conversation in the hall. And lunch is served. Thank you.